Hearing is now resumed.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. For the record, Leadham Initial T, appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. Gentlemen, I want to begin by taking up again some of the themes I was developing with you yesterday afternoon. And invariably, we are about halfway through these projects, these research projects, and invariably, when one looks at the recommendations, one sees things such as we need to do research in these areas, we need a better data set, we need this, we need that. And I suspect that's what's the rest of the projects that are coming are also going to say we need more research. And is that just the nature of science, that science always needs more research or needs more data? I'll just throw that open as a general discussion, and then I want to take up some questions from that.
Yes, I think it's a very good question and certainly worthy of considerable discussion. It's an interesting one. I think in terms of the requirement for more research, when we're being faced with fairly specific questions such as these that have been raised about the effect of marine mammals on sockeye salmon, these are difficult animals to study compared to many terrestrial animals, and so some of the questions are fairly straightforward, but are very difficult in practice to collect the kind of information we need to address those questions. And so we are making progress, but at times it's slow. New technologies have become available to provide greater insight into the diet of marine mammals through chemical tracers like fatty acids and stable isotopes, or genetic analysis of prey remains. But these are recent innovations, and they're just now being implemented in field studies. So indeed, there is these animals are fairly data poor, especially with regard to some of the pressing questions that we've been deliberating on.
All right. Dr. Treitz?
Yeah, I agree with the point you're making. I mean, so often in science, we ask sometimes simple questions, but those questions not only give us sometimes, a simple answer, they often raise 2 or 3 more new questions. I think the one thing I've learned to appreciate over time is that essentially the more we learn, the more we realize how little we truly understood. What we try to do with our recommendations is not do that catch-all phrase at the end which just says, give us more money, and we'll answer more questions.
I'm sure you would take it as someone we're offering, though.
Yeah, but what we try to do is sort of focus things on where the biggest gaps were by identifying 6 species we think should get some more focus if the primary question is sockeye salmon. And also that final recommendation, which was the power of using a model to synthesize what we currently understand to help focus our research to get the best value out of the money that might be put forward to answer the key questions that may resolve some of those key uncertainties.
And Dr. Ford, when you were giving me your answer, you talked about some of these issues around research were difficult issues. I take it difficult can be equated to costly.
Indeed. Marine mammals can, depending on the species, of course, be extremely expensive to study. They're in often remote areas at sea and require large ships to get out there to undertake field studies. So that is often a limiting factor in progress towards answering some of these questions.
And I would suspect that Mr. Olesiuk and Dr. Ford, as staff scientists for DFO, that you're in a world where you're scrambling for dollars. Is that right, or is that a fair statement?
We're certainly operating as efficiently as we can with the resources we have available, and there's always more that could be done with greater resources. As I mentioned, in my research groups. Priority activities, it does involve considerable time at sea, and the reality is that those costs can be prohibitive to do everything we'd like to do.
Mr. Olesiuk?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we are scrambling for research funding, and it is, I think, the nature of science that there's always going to be new questions arising. But I think if you look at the science program, pinnipeds, we've been at it a little longer than cetaceans. About 3 decades we've been doing serious science and DFO, and there really has been very measurable progress. We know a lot more about abundance, status, diet, prey requirements of these animals that we did 30 years ago. And our questions now are becoming more focused on very specific issues. And I think that's the nature of science.
But if I can get the focus back to the key question that this commission is facing is what was the cause of the 2009 decline. And if you can put it in that stark language, I suspect that at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to say that X is the cause, but we're likely to say this, that the salmon have been declining. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts, as I think you said, Dr. Trites. It's like this is happening through a number of contributing factors. And that is perplexing, because then if we were depending upon science to provide the answers, then there are two key questions that come out from that. One is, where are we going to find the funding to allow science to show us the way through this predicament? And two, who is going to control what kind of science gets done? Because you are focusing upon predation, and that may be a contributing cause, but who's going to be pulling the strings and actually saying what science should go forward? And I wonder if any of the panel members have any reaction to what I've just suggested.
Maybe if I could just start on that. You know, there's a big focus on what research has DFO done. At the same time, there's a lot of research being done on marine mammals by NGOs, by academics. So for example, I lead a program that has both cetacean and pinniped research, and I have 14 researchers working on pinnipeds. A lot of that money is coming from, it's not coming from the Canadian government, it's coming from external sources, private foundations, US sources. So there are other people contributing to trying to answer some of these questions. A lot of it are focused on why marine mammals are abundant in some areas, declining elsewhere. In terms of who sets those agendas, it's often by, I guess there's a variety of ways that gets done. But I just want to make the point that there are different groups doing research. I think all are contributing to answering some of these key questions.
And Dr. Ford?
If I could, I think if I understand your question, it's really where do we go with predation specifically as a factor in the 2009 situation with Fraser River sockeye, as well as the decline over the 15-year period under consideration. I think what will come from this process here, as well as other related processes, such as the Pacific Salmon Commission synthesis workshop last June it was, that addressed multiple hypotheses that of factors that could have played significant roles in the overall picture. I think the result of these kinds of efforts will ultimately result in the most likely significant factors, and in this Fraser River sockeye situation, and that ultimately will steer the future direction for much of the science. I think we're all in agreement that marine mammals seem to not, there's no evidence that they played a role in the situation in 2009. They may have played a role in the overall decline over the past 15 years as a result of increasing predation levels for various reasons, mostly to do with changes in abundance. And research in this area of their role in the overall ecosystem, to include predation on all species, I think will continue and may help shed further light on the contributing factor of marine mammals than we now understand.
It strikes me that the scientific community is very much a collaborative community. You get together from time to time to discuss the results of your research. You share data where it can be shared without somebody scooping your paper, and you basically, it strikes me that it's a pretty transparent kind of process that leads to the development of science. Am I completely wrong on that approach?
I think in the case of our work, much of the research that we undertake to provide science advice for DFO management is certainly reviewed by peers, both internally and externally, especially if it is ultimately published in the open scientific literature. And that process of review and revision is as hopefully transparent as it can be. So it is very much a collaborative effort.
And you would agree with me, Dr. Ford and Mr. Lesiak, as DFO scientists, that it would be important for you to share the results of your work and to basically get it out to the public so everyone is aware of it. Isn't that accurate?
Well, yes, I would agree. And it's not just getting out the final result, but working with our colleagues during the intermediate processes so they can identify problems and weaknesses before we get too far along. But getting back to your question as to how do we proceed from here and set priorities and identify, as John has said, with a relatively high degree of confidence, we can conclude that marine mammals were not responsible for the low returns in 2009. As far as the general decline in productivity, I think we've narrowed it down to a couple of marine mammal species. And in the case of sea lions, we've identified when and where they are now feeding on sockeye. And then we've had a series of workshops in DFO where we get together with our colleagues that are studying salmon, and they're looking at the migration routes of salmon, where the mortality is occurring, and based on that, we are going to come up with presumably some sort of multidisciplinary projects where we're combining the factors that could be causing mortality with information where that mortality is occurring.
Well, my time is drawing to a close with you. I wanted to just get your reaction to one question I had about Exhibit 795. This was a DFO synthesis workshop on the decline of Fraser River sockeye. Am I right in assuming that this was a workshop that was conducted by and for DFO scientists alone and not the greater scientific community?
Yes, that's correct. It's just a follow-up to the Salmon Commission sponsored meeting last June, and it was basically to continue that effort towards reviewing available evidence, leading to, again, as it says, synthesis to try and keep some momentum going, internally to keep addressing these questions and steering direction for future research.
Thank you. I'm afraid my time is up. Thank you for the discussion.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Reeves, initial C for the First Nations Coalition. And just for the benefits of our panel, the First Nations Coalition includes the First Nations Fisheries Commission, which is a provincial organization, the Council of the Haida Nation, 3 Saanich First Nations, as well as tribes from Chehalis up to the upper headwaters. I have 2 series of questions, and my first questions will be directed towards Dr. Treitz. Mr. Lund, could you please pull up Exhibit 783, the technical report? And I'd like to go to page 11. And at the second paragraph of the report, on page 11, it says, another aspect of environmental conditions relates to the impact of water temperature. While temperature will have a direct influence on metabolic rates of sockeye salmon, it also impacts other parts of the ecosystem, including the risk of predation. And then it just talks about how this was illustrated. And Peterson and Kitchell predicted that warmer climatic conditions can lead to an increase in predation rates in the range of 26 to 31%. And our question is this: if warmer climate conditions did lead to an increase in predation rates of, say, 26 to 31% in marine waters, which predators on your list would become an immediate or significant concern to sockeye salmon, and in this case, Fraser River sockeye salmon?
Good question, but I'm not sure that I can give you a definitive answer to it. What's a bit surprising, I think, to a lot of people is realizing that one of the consequences of warming oceans is that it's going to affect the food requirements of fish. And it's because it's going to raise their metabolic rates. They're going to have to eat more food to compensate for that. To acquire more food, they're either going to take greater risks to be out and be exposed to be eaten by other predators that also have increased feeding requirements as well. So it's hard to say at this point who's going to come out the victor and all that, except there's a realization that all the fish are going to require more food, and that food has to come within that fish community.
But what about migrating animals? How would that impact them?
Are you referring in this case to fish or
Yeah,
to
I mean,
mammals?
I guess we're or mammals. I guess we speak to you.
The mammals are not going to be affected in the sense of their metabolic rates are not going to be increased. They're breathing air. They're not acquiring their oxygen out of the water. So if anything, for the mammals, what will be affecting them is whether or not the distribution of the fish shifts.
Okay.
Are they moving? Although some of those fish may also now be exposed to more predation. This is really theoretical, and we're guessing. And time will be what will show us, for in fact, what is or will happen and occur. Right now, the projections, and these will be coming from models, are projecting increased food requirements, increased risk of being eaten. And for marine mammals, they may not suffer directly, but they too will be playing a role in changing the face of our ecosystems.
Right, and I guess that leads into my next question. And one of your last recommendations on page 83, I don't know if we need to go there, talked about the need to create an ecosystem model as one of your recommendations. And given the complexity of the system, including climate changes, would you agree, I guess, that we would need ongoing monitoring of all these factors, including climate, temperature, and that sort of thing, if we're going to keep updating the models?
Yes, I would agree, but at the same time, it may not be necessary to monitor everything in great detail. We have a lot of knowledge already, and the model will help to bring what we do know together in a way that we can evaluate it with a common set of indices. So, and then over time, the model can be updated as better information comes in. Or we may identify from the model what the key information gaps are, and therefore help to focus our research efforts as well as our research dollars to get that information. So the models are very valuable tools for essentially creating an encyclopedia of knowledge, in this case here, for the sockeye salmon, what we do know and what we need to learn.
Okay. Just wondering about, given ecosystem modeling, and I'm not sure if you're able to answer this question, but are you aware of bringing in traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations and Indigenous people into ecosystem modeling? And
as a member of COSEWIC, we have a subcommittee that does bring traditional knowledge to our committees. It influences the status reports we do. And so that information is used. Sometimes it may not be quantitative, but it is qualitative in a way that we can put in to the models to look at changes over time, for example. So the models are built with a wide variety of information, and certainly do value any insights that people have about the systems, how they were, and what's being seen today. Sometimes the model is also very good for even verifying observations that people have made using a different set of data, a different set of observations, and collectively they help to build a fuller understanding of what has happened.
And perhaps I could just ask you, Dr. Ford, or you, Mr. Alesiak, is DFO science, if you're working on an ecosystem approach which is suggested in the Strait of Georgia study, is traditional ecological knowledge being used in the creation of indicators for that model?
I can't speak to the modeling exercises because that's outside of my area, but I can confirm that traditional knowledge is incorporated wherever possible in development of recovery strategies for species that are listed under the Species at Risk Act, including all the whale species and other marine mammal sea otters that have been listed. So that is an important component of those efforts.
And in the case of my work, the modeling I'm doing, we're working with species that I don't think there is a history of any sort for hake in the Strait of Georgia that I'm aware of. But in our general marine mammal assessment, our pinniped assessments, we try to gather as much knowledge from all sources before we go out and survey a new area, for example. And we'll work with all groups, including First Nations, to sort of identify where haul-out sites are to make sure that we include them in our surveys.
I guess my next set of questions will be directed to you, Mr. Lysiak, and anyone else can follow up. I'm specifically talking about now pinnipeds and harbor seals. And Mr. Lunn, if you could pull up Exhibit 796 and go to slide 30. Thank you. Mr. Lysiak, yesterday in testimony, you talked about that harbor seals had not been systematically studied on the Fraser River, and no study had been done, and then you talked about that studies could be done, and I believe yesterday one of the study papers suggested that you had an outline of how that could be done. And I'm wondering about this table here, and it gives an estimate of harbor seals. Now, did that include in the Fraser River, or is this estimate outside of that?
It does not include the Fraser River. And the information that we have, there were studies done in the 50s at both in the upper reaches of the Skeena and Fraser River. And as far as we know, there are seals a long ways up the river, but in relatively low abundance. And they're probably an insignificant number compared to the BC population.
Right, and what would that be based on? Like, how would you know that number of abundance?
It would be based on the surveys that were done up there in the 50s, where they made a concerted effort to and noted large concentrations of seals at the mouth of the Fraser, but very few seals upriver. We do include the animals in the lower part of the river in our surveys. And then just the anecdotal reports we receive from fishery officers, whoever are in those areas. What we get are reports of scattered individuals, not, I don't know of any major haul-out sites.
But other than the 1950s study, there's nothing more recent to say whether the abundances of harbor seals in the river may have changed since the 1950s to today. There's no systematic quantitative data for that.
No systematic quantitative, just these anecdotal reports.
Okay, and so then yesterday you were speaking of a follow-up workshop with DFO scientists where you worked on sort of the widely perceived predators. You discussed that yesterday. And one of the things I wanted to know is, what do you think drives the wide perception, I guess, that harbor seals, because you mentioned harbor seals as one of the widely perceived predators. What do you think drives that perception then if there isn't actual quantitative data of the number of seals in, say, the Fraser River?
Well, what drives the perception that they're a key salmon predator is that their predation on salmon is concentrated in rivers and estuaries where there tend to be a lot of people. Large prey like salmon are brought to the surface, and so you can see seals feeding on salmon. Smaller prey like herring are consumed underwater. Hake are consumed at night when they migrate up in the water column. So if you watch seals feeding, basically what you see them feeding on is salmon. So that's why they're perceived to be the most important pinniped predator. In reality, I think Steller sea lions are the most important predator, but their predation is occurring offshore, 10 to 30 to 40 kilometers offshore, as salmon are entering coastal waters. And that's out of sight, out of mind. People don't observe that, and you don't appreciate the level of predation that's going on.
Right. Mr. Lunn, if you could take me to our tab 3. And this is a letter to the Marine Mammal Coordinator for Fisheries and Oceans in the Pacific region. And from Keith Forrest, who is a test fishing biologist. And here they're discussing a test fishing site and predation by harbor seals. And in the second paragraph, they talk about the Cottonwood and Wannock test fisheries have been severely impacted by seal predation. Seals now consume a significant portion of salmon that are caught, up to 100% of the catch. Now, yesterday you referred to marine mammals taking stock at certain specific sites, like test fishing sites. Am I to understand that's known as depredation? Is that the term that you use?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm wondering is if the test fishing sites and these kinds of, I guess, letters and that sort of thing, what sort of drives that idea that harbor seals are high predators within the Fraser River when people see them at test sites and that taking a lot of salmon. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's just part of the perception issue. It's the seals are opportunistic predators. They'll take the fish wherever they are most vulnerable, and if that's in nets and at weirs and things, that's where they'll take fish over rather than free swimming salmon.
Right. And I guess my final question in this line of questionings is, do you think that the department maybe perhaps could better communicate the results of, say, your research to date and perhaps the technical report that harbor seals you don't believe are a major predator, somehow to offset that perception, even for our clients who have, a concern about these issues? Is there something that could be done in terms of communicating that lower levels of predation?
There is, and we have in the past, and it's too far in the past, put out sort of brochure-type documents that translate our research into information for public consumption, and we should be doing more of that.
And perhaps just a follow-up question then is, are those pamphlets are no longer being produced for the public by DFO?
They're not. The last one was really done in like the late 80s and is outdated.
Right, and is that just a funding issue, or?
It's a funding and priority issue. I think there's been a more recent cetacean pamphlet put out that. I'll let John answer that.
That's true. There are efforts also under, more so in recent years, with providing information on the DFO website, and so that is becoming, I think, more and more the sort of forum for interacting with the public in terms of providing science information.
Right.
Yeah, and I should add that I forgot that when we write a technical report and it's peer-reviewed, there's almost always an accompanying science advisor report. And those are written for managers, but the requirement is that we eliminate scientific jargon. Right. And so that a naturalist or an interested person would find those useful, and they are posted on our website.
Right. And are these scientific data or science outcomes, if you will, communicated at broader meetings? Do you know? I mean, do you report out to managers, and then if there's meetings between First Nations along the Fraser River and managers from DFO, do you know that if this information that you've found through your scientific studies is communicated to First Nations?
Yeah, again, insofar as sort of time allows, we do, I routinely give talks to various, from naturalists to sport fishing organizations to, commercial fishery management groups, give talks on sort of an update of the work we're doing and what the priorities and issues are.
Okay. I think I'll just leave that line of questioning there. My last question for you, Mr. Olesiak, is yesterday you talked about harbor seal impacts, and you mentioned that they may have, or you may have actually been speaking also for Steller sea lions, it wasn't clear, had small depressed, could have an impact on small depressed salmon stocks. Oh, yes, sorry. Perhaps I could just mark our tab 3 as an exhibit. Sorry.
Exhibit number 799.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, and that is particularly an issue for harbor seals.
Harbor seals.
And impacts on salmon stocks.
And what depressed salmon stocks were you specifically referring to there?
The best known cases are Puntledge River summer Chinook. But I think there are similar issues with several Chinook stocks in the Strait of Georgia, Cowichan Chinook, Quinsam Chinook.
Right. And did it relate at all to cultus or Saginaw sockeye?
Well, Saginaw sockeye is another, would be prime example. There was a anecdotal information that seals were feeding on salmon in the small river that connects Saginaw Lake to the Strait of Georgia, and we did actually issue. There are so few sockeye that it wouldn't be practical to go in there and do a science assessment, but we did issue a nuisance seal license to remove any seals feeding in that immediate area, just because that run was so seriously depressed.
And what about any of the other Fraser River sockeye? Would it impact any of them?
I don't think Fraser River sockeye, but if you look at some of the steelhead runs and some of the depressed coho stocks, I would have concerns with seal predation in those stocks.
Okay. Thank you for that. Those are my questions.
I'm not sure if Mr. Timberg has any questions in re-examination.
No.
Sir, I wonder if I could just ask one brief question of this panel. And I ask it because Mr. Leadham raised it, and I'm not sure, in fairness to the three of you, whether you're the appropriate panel members to answer. But I was trying to, perhaps, Mr. Lunn, if you could bring up Exhibit 795. And I think Dr. Ford mentioned that this April 2011 in-house DFO session or workshop was a follow-up to the June 2010 Pacific Salmon Commission Forum. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. What I was trying to understand, and as again, in fairness to you, you may not be the people to answer this, but within DFO or within the larger community of science, and I'm talking about science within DFO or the larger community, is there an ongoing overarching body that does the macro analysis, drawing together all the streams of research that are taking place, trying to understand it, and then share that in a way that allows you to draft an agenda for some suggestions to go forward, other than on a reaction basis where there's some event that you react to, but on an ongoing basis? Now, you may not know because you're working in specific areas and you may not be aware of this, but I'm just trying to understand in your answers to Mr. Leadham about who's going to draw the agenda, who's going to drive the research. I think Dr. Treitz mentioned there are private foundations and obviously universities and others who are involved in a variety of research projects. I'm just trying to get a sense of, is this a scrambled situation in our world of research, or is there actually some game plan here now in 2011 and going forward that takes advantage of all this work that's been done and tries to get a sense of, for the politicians and the bureaucrats and the managers, where should they be going forward and where should they be assigning the resources to go forward?
I think those are excellent questions, and if I could speak broadly, of course, DFO science is involved with a wide diversity of different kinds of research activities on a wide variety of different taxon groups, from whales to seals to invertebrates and fish and so on. And those, I think historically, were rather isolated in their direction. I think with the move broadly towards ecosystem-based management, and I think the Strait of Georgia Research Initiative is an example of how to catalyze those kinds of interactions and those kinds of syntheses that are needed to better understand the interconnections between predators and prey, for example. If I could provide perhaps just a quick example in my own area, we about 5 years ago discovered that resident killer whales, which I was describing yesterday, appeared to be dependent on Chinook salmon, to the point that several years of depressed Chinook salmon abundance availability in the late 90s caused a very significant increase in the mortality rate of killer whales. And so it appeared that there's a strong connection there. And when Chinook stocks recovered in the early 2000s and went above the long-term average the killer whale mortality rates went down below normal. And so as a result of that, we've been working with internally to work with Chinook salmon managers to better understand how for us in the marine mammal section, how salmon management functions and how predation is incorporated into the management plans. And this has then led to an upcoming series of, or I should say a recent meeting that took place in March, where we brought together experts from DFO science in terms of salmon and marine mammals, DFO salmon managers, and also our colleagues from the U.S. National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration science personnel in both mammals and salmon to start better understanding the what can be done to accommodate the needs of these predators in the management of fisheries. And this now is going to lead to a series of workshops co-sponsored by DFO and NOAA in the U.S. over the next 2 years to better refine the kinds of management tools that we have at our disposal to ensure that these ecosystem connections are recognized in fisheries management to provide for, in this case, the recovery of killer whales. That's just an example of how these different disciplines are brought together.
And maybe I can give you sort of my perceptions as an academic. I think the killer whale example that Dr. Ford just gave is a good one in the sense that that's a cross-boundary issue. And almost by definition then brings in the U.S. researchers from the other side. I think in terms of fisheries management, let's say within British Columbia, as an academic, I don't feel that there is a game plan. I think we look towards DFO to take leadership in this, but often I think the academics would feel that their opinions, even though we are training the graduate students who will ultimately be the fisheries managers or the major fisheries researchers, I think there's a tendency to feel quite cut off from that. As a result, there are a number of independent initiatives. I think some of the foundations would probably share some of those same views. I think we could be doing a lot more together. This ecosystem research initiative was a wonderful initiative, but the academics aren't involved. There was no money to include. And so I think that there are initiatives that could be taken to make sure we have all the brightest minds in British Columbia working together to solve these problems. But at this point, I think there's just too many independent initiatives, and we could do a lot more by working together.
Yeah, and I was just going to follow up, and again, I think the Ecosystem Research Initiative stands out as an example of a project that was not reactionary to any issue. It was more visionary. We recognize Strait of George as an important ecosystem, and the theme of the whole project was to sort of plan for what the strait will look like 30 years from now in the future. And I think what's happened, though, is that we now have the Oceans Act. It used to be that the Department of Fisheries operated solely under the Fisheries Act, which was basically resource management. I think we now, with the Oceans Act, have a much broader mandate that will hopefully increasingly consider these broad ecosystem interactions.
Dr. Ford, did you?
I just wanted to follow up on a comment Dr. Trites made, and I neglected to mention that in this recent meeting to do with killer whales and Chinook salmon, there were in fact representatives from academia, from non-governmental organizations involved in a workshop that was a 3-day workshop, I believe. And in these upcoming joint meetings with our U.S. colleagues, it's actually going to be, these workshops are going to be modeled after the PSC meeting from last June, where there's an expert panel who will be overseeing all the science that's presented and discussed, and they will synthesize recommendations from those discussions. And that panel will not include, it will be dominated by non-governmental science representatives from universities and elsewhere.
And just as a final point on that, I think that killer whale workshop is a great example and a great model of the way things could be. And it'd be nice to see that extended to other species, such as sockeye salmon.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if I may follow with one question based on your question, if that's possible. And I think it's an important, I mean, I very much appreciate the nature and the importance of your question. And it's one that's been one that my clients watch with much care. And so if I could just contribute to this dialogue, I would like to. And it's Brenda Gardner for the First Nations Coalition. I heard in the question, a part of the Commissioner's question, this notion that science should take the lead. My clients, of course, might take issue with that, Commissioner Cohen, because in our view, ecosystem management, of course, is something First Nations have been doing all their life. And so they believe they have something very important to contribute in that, and that ecosystem management requires a collaborative look right from the get-go on how we look at the environment, how we feel as part of the ecosystem, how we are a part of the ecosystem, what indicators we look at, what questions we ask of science, who reviews the results, all of those things. And so I wonder if you, as learned people in these fields with different perspectives, might also want to add a comment on how important it is to have the body that's asking the questions to reflect deeply a multidisciplinary approach, including very respectfully the First Nations approach to the ecosystem.
Perhaps I'll start on that. I wasn't saying that science should take the lead. My feeling was that DFO, as the management agency, should be playing a greater leadership role in this. In doing so, I believe it should be more inclusive. I feel particularly academics, the NGOs, First Nations, people who are concerned about the health of our oceans and long-term sustainability. So I think, indeed, it does take a more collaborative approach. I think the workshop that Dr. Ford made reference to is a good example of bringing people together, and I think even that initiative can be expanded. Hopefully we'll see more of that in the future.
Ford.
I'm definitely not the best to address sort of broader policy issues for DFO. I can only really speak to my own area of experience and interaction with First Nations in the science that we undertake, and we do work very closely with various different First Nation groups on surveys for marine mammal cetaceans in various regions of the British Columbia coast that are funded by the Species at Risk program. We work very closely with them in survey designs, in collection of data, and in basically providing guidance to help address the kinds of questions they have in the different regions of the coast. So we have and are working quite closely with different First Nations groups at that level.
And I'll just say, I do think there has been an improvement in our sort of consultation and inclusion of all interests, including First Nations. If you look at recovery planning that's done under SARA, or development of that sea lion management plan, those things, we tend to have workshops that are or meetings that are inclusive rather than exclusive, and try to have all interests represented, including First Nations, I believe.
I'm not going to take any more time, Commissioner Cohen. This is a topic that we're going to pursue hopefully more with the next panel, and so it's great that we have the opportunity now.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, I have one brief question just to follow up on your question. And the question is, who at DFO is the person who could provide the Commissioner with an answer to this question about a macro analysis of science projects?
I believe it would be Dr. Ian Perry, who has been overseeing the Strait of Georgia Ecosystem Research Initiative. I think he would be the best person to go to first.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lestiak, do you have anything further?
No, but if you for who is included in these discussions, I would look at the Marine Mammal Coordinator and the SARA Coordinator to see who are invited to participate in these processes.
Mr. Commissioner, I'd have just 3 quick issues in reexamination, which will take us no further than 11. The first question is for Mr. Lysiak and Dr. Trites, I'm going to see if we can achieve some agreement on slide 27 of Exhibit 796. Both of you commented on either this slide or another version of it. Mr. Timber put this slide to you, Mr. Lysiak, and a similar version was commented on by Dr. Trites. Although the species were ordered differently in the other version. And my question is, looking at that red bar of sockeye or pink, I'll ask you, Mr. Lysiak, first. As a basic default scientific assumption, wouldn't one assume that that large, that 15% bar there would most likely break down in similar proportions as the sockeye and pink in the other bars?
That concept is right. If you could go to maybe the next slide or the slide after, can we just advance one at a time here? I will. Yeah, that's actually, that's actually the slide right, that's a key slide right there. And that you would partition the unknowns based on what is known.
Right.
And so most of the sockeye that sea lions are consuming are on the Scott Islands, that pie to the left. And there are, I would draw your attention to the three sections on the right. The dark red is a known sockeye. The red is the unknowns, and the pink are pink salmon. And so you would partition them based on where the unknowns occurred, not just in the whole sample. And so based on that, I would kind of assume that about half of the unknowns would be pink and half sockeye. And then the rest of the sockeye are being consumed along the west coast, a much lower fraction of the total. And in that case, the unknowns occur where relatively few sockeye were identified and lots of pink. And I would partition those based on the unknowns based on the relative percentage of the knowns. And then you need to weight these according to how many sockeye are being consumed in each of those areas. But it's kind of 50-50 because most of the sockeye are in the Scott Islands. And I just add, I realize that the timing is awkward, but I expect to have the results of those unknowns next week, so it's...
Oh, you shouldn't offer things like that. I'm just teasing you. I'm going to ask Dr. Trites if he could comment on that assessment of how one would, in Mr. Lysiak's words, partition the unknown.
No, I would do just as he's done, and expect the results will come out that way. And we'll see when those DNA results come back, if the expectation that there's probably more pinks in that unknowns than sockeye stands up or not. But that would be my guess. And maybe one other point to make on this is, we have to keep in mind that these were samples that didn't come from the mouth of the Fraser, they came, in this case, from the Scott Islands. And so we're making an assumption that all those were Fraser River sockeye. Some of those could have been Columbia River or other runs. And so we have to keep in mind that without doing more work yet to figure out the origins of that DNA, which runs there really were, we're making some assumptions here about how to break that up by rivers.
My second question is for Dr. Ford and Mr. Lysiak, and this relates to Exhibit 797, if we could pull that up, Mr. Lunn, by Mr. Timberg, whether you agreed that the Steller Sea Lion Management Plan is similar to resident killer whale management that Dr. Ford had described earlier. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I vaguely remember it.
And your answer to the question was yes. And I'm going to suggest to you and to Dr. Ford that the way that DFO manages salmon and resident killer whales on one hand, and the way that DFO manages salmon and Steller sea lions on the other hand is clearly different in one fairly obvious respect. And so my first question for you, Mr. Lysiak, is that this management plan for the Steller sea lion obviously does not identify critical habitat, right?
Correct, and I think there was a question I was asked of what are the requirements for a species of special concern. And the requirement is a management plan, but not definition of critical habitat. If a species is threatened or endangered, that requires a recovery plan, which is different than a management plan, and designation of critical habitat.
Exactly, and so Dr. Ford, in contrast for the resident killer whales, DFO, as a function of that recovery strategy, is actually required to legally protect salmon availability as a part of the resident killer whale's critical habitat, right?
That's correct.
And so my final question is one that arose out of the discussion we've been having with, arising from the Commissioner's question about is there an overall game plan for all these science pieces to come together? And my question is, in your work as marine mammal scientists doing this research and looking at the relationship between marine mammals and their prey and salmon, who at DFO gives you, if anybody, direct guidance on ensuring that your science is part of that overall management game plan? Who do you understand to be the captain of the team? Who's creating that game plan and saying, we need this science from you, Dr. Ford, or we need this science from you, Mr. Oleksiak, to ensure that the marine mammal piece of our big game plan is fit? Do you know if that person exists?
In terms of marine mammal interactions with management, it's really facilitated by the marine mammal management coordinator, Paul Cottrell, who is in fisheries and aquaculture management and interacts with various fisheries managers, as well as with habitat issues that would potentially impact marine mammals. So major construction projects, seismic exploration surveys for geophysical research, these kinds of things can have impacts on marine mammals. So the Marine Mammal Management Coordinator is the key sort of liaison with all these other sectors.
So liaison's a very interesting word, and that's how I also understand Paul Cottrell's very important role. He's liaising between the managers and the scientists, but who is making, who's designing the game plan that Mr. Cottrell is being responsive to? That's more the question. Who's deciding, for example, how marine mammals and their prey will be co-managed in the Strait of Georgia? Do you know who on the other end of Paul Cottrell is making that decision or giving that direction?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It depends on the species involved, the kinds of interactions that reveal themselves to be significant. And I think I can just speak again to the resident killer whale Chinook interaction as an example of the kinds of the process that was involved. As soon as it was recognized that Chinook salmon were as sort of counterintuitively so important to these animals, that triggered a series of interactions with management to better understand, again, how predation is taken into account and then what the next steps might be. So I just think it really is through an ongoing sort of dialogue interaction between science and management, and again, facilitated by the marine mammal manager to bring those groups together.
Dr. Oleksiak, is there anything you disagree with on that?
I don't disagree, but I was going to say that we are, like I mentioned before, it's a two-way street. We are constantly feeding up to managers what we think are issues that might be important, but ultimately, we don't decide what assessments to do, whether to go out and do a sea lion study or a harbor seal study in a certain area. Those come through management questions, requests for science advice. And then that, in turn, translates to allocating and identifying priorities for funding. And that would be done at my level. The priorities are set by our division chief, who would, management is asking for this particular advice. Can we afford to do it? How are we going to, how much is it going to cost? And
my last question is just, who's your division chief? What's that person's name?
Laura Brown.
Great.
So she's Marine Ecosystems and Aquaculture Division.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, we're at 11 o'clock. I'm going to suggest that we take an early break to facilitate the panelists changing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.